My elitist parents crashed my wedding, so I went full nuclear. I literally told security that if Jim and Joyce showed up in their tacky Bentley, they were to be arrested for trespassing. But money talks, and apparently, my father screams louder than a venue coordinator, making minimum wage. We were right at the vows. Dustin was holding my hands, his palms sweating against mine, and I was finally breathing for the first time in 3 years. Then the double oak doors slammed open with a sound like a gunshot. There they were. Joyce was actually wearing white, a floor-length silk chiffon gown that cost more than my entire venue, purely to assert dominance. Jim stood behind her, looking at the rustic barn interior, like he had just stepped into a sewage plant. The silence in the room was so loud it hurt my ears. Joyce didn't even wait for the gasps to settle. She just marched down the aisle, her heels clicking on the hardwood like a countdown timer. She shouted over the quiet music that I was making a catastrophic mistake by marrying the help. She actually called Dustin the help to his face because he manages a landscaping crew. I snatched the microphone from the efficient's trembling hand before Joyce could take another step. I didn't let myself think or hesitate. I just spoke. I looked my mother dead in the eye and said, "Joyce, turn around and walk out, or I play the voicemail from 2022 over these speakers right now. You know the one. The recording where you admitted to paying off Mateo to keep the family reputation clean after what he did to me." The color drained from her face, and the room went deathly quiet. I thought I won, but then 2 things happened that I didn't account for. Jim pulled out his phone, pointed the camera at my face, and smiled. He said, "Go ahead, Susie, say it for the live stream. My investors and your followers would love to see how unstable you've become since you went off your medication." And worse, I felt Dustin's hand slip away from mine. I turned to look at him, and he wasn't looking at my parents with anger. He was looking at me with absolute fear. "Dustin, don't," I whispered, reaching for him, but he took a full step back. His eyes were darting between Jim's camera and my trembling hands. He looked like he was looking at a stranger. That hurt worse than Joyce's white dress, but I couldn't break down, not while Jim was broadcasting to the shareholders. I turned to the camera lens, fixing my hair with a terrifying calmness that I definitely didn't feel. "Hey, everyone watching," I said, my voice steady enough to slice glass. Since my father brought up my medical history, let's clarify. I was never prescribed medication for bipolar disorder. I was prescribed sedatives because Jim here didn't like that I wanted to press charges against Mateo. Jim's smile faltered. I saw his thumb hover over the stop button. I had him. I solved the PR nightmare by nuking the narrative. He lowered the phone, his face twisting into that purple shade of rage I knew too well. "You ungrateful little brat," he hissed, shoving the phone into his pocket. "We are trying to save you from yourself. Get out," I said, pointing to the doors. "Security is already on the way." "Actually," Joyce interrupted, her voice sickeningly sweet as she stepped closer to the altar. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a folded stack of papers. "Security works for us, darling. We bought the venue last week through a shell company." My stomach dropped through the floor. They bought the venue. That was the first new nightmare. I looked at the security guards by the door, and they were staring at the floor, refusing to make eye contact. I was trapped at my own wedding in a building owned by the people trying to destroy me. Then came the second nightmare. I turned to Dustin, begging him with my eyes to say something, to throw them out, but he didn't look at them. He looked at me, his voice shaking. "Susie, you told me your parents were dead." The silence that followed was suffocating. I had lied. I told him they died in a car crash because it was easier than explaining the monsters standing in front of us. Now I looked like a pathological liar in front of the man I was supposed to marry, while my parents held the deed to the building we were standing in. Joyce smirked, waving the papers. "Oh, he didn't know. This is going to be fun. Dustin, listen to me. I lied because if you knew they existed, you would have run away, just like you are doing right now. I needed you to be safe from them." I said the words fast, desperate to bridge the gap between us. Dustin looked at me, his eyes wet. He wasn't angry anymore. He was broken. He whispered that we don't lie to each other, but he didn't pull his hand away this time. I solved the paralysis in the room by making a decision instantly. "We are leaving," I announced, gripping his hand tight. "Right now. Screw the venue. Screw the deposit. We are going to the courthouse." I started dragging him down the aisle, forcing my legs to move past my mother's smug face. I thought we were free. I thought we could just walk out, get in his truck, and deal with the lies later. But Jim stepped directly in our path, blocking the aisle like a bouncer. "He isn't going anywhere, Susie," Jim said, looking at Dustin with a predatory grin. "Tell her, Dustin. Tell her about the loan." I froze. I looked at Dustin, waiting for him to tell my father to move. But Dustin went pale. He couldn't even look at me. He stared at the floorboards and stammered that he needed new equipment for the landscaping business. He said the bank denied him, but a private investor reached out last month. That investor was me, Jim announced, buttoning his suit jacket casually. I hold the note on his entire livelihood, $200,000, and if he walks out of this building with you, I call the note due immediately. He will be bankrupt by tomorrow morning. That was the first new nightmare. My parents didn't just buy the venue, they bought my fiancé without him even knowing it. I was ready to scream, to tear his suit apart, but then blue and red lights flashed against the barn windows, illuminating the terror on the guests' faces. And that brings us to the second issue, Joyce said, checking her diamond watch. I called the police 10 minutes ago. I told them my daughter is having a severe manic episode and is a danger to herself and others. They are here for a 5150 hold, darling. The doors opened again, and this time, it wasn't guests. It was two uniformed officers scanning the room. I looked at Dustin, waiting for him to defend me, to tell them I was sane, but he just looked at his shoes, terrified of losing his business. I was completely alone. Officer, do not touch me, I said, taking a step back and raising my hands so the entire room could see I was unarmed and non-threatening. I spoke slowly and clearly, making sure my voice carried to the body cameras. My mother filed a false report. I am lucid, I am sober, and I am currently being held hostage in a venue my parents fraudulently purchased to entrap me. If you drag a calm bride out of her own wedding while my father live streams it to the internet, you will be the stars of a civil rights lawsuit by Monday morning. I solved the immediate threat of being institutionalized by using their own narcissism against them. I pointed at Jim's phone. Look at the live stream, officer. Check the playback. Who is screaming? Who is making threats? It is not me. The officer hesitated. He looked at Joyce, who was manicuring her nails, and then at Jim, who was still holding the phone up like a weapon. The cop shook his head and radioed that it was a civil dispute, not a medical emergency. They turned around and walked out the door. I could breathe again, but my victory lasted exactly 10 seconds. Jim didn't look defeated. He looked bored. He put his phone away and looked at Dustin. Time is up, son. Make a choice. Walk away from her and keep your company, or hold her hand and watch your trucks get repossessed tomorrow. Dustin looked at me. I was ready to run with him. I was ready to live in a cardboard box if it meant we were together. But he pulled his hand away from me like I was on fire. I am sorry, Susie, he whispered, his voice cracking. I worked too hard for this business. I can't lose it all. He stepped back, moving to stand next to my father. That was the first new nightmare. My fiancé just sold me out for $200,000 and left me standing alone at the altar. I watched the man I loved trade our future for a landscaping fleet. Then came the second nightmare. Joyce clapped her hands together, beaming like she had just won a pageant. Well, now that the help has been dismissed, we can proceed with the real ceremony. The side door opened, and a man walked in wearing a tuxedo that matched the groomsmen. It was Mateo. The man who ruined my life was walking toward me with a ring box in his hand. Mateo looked at me like I was a prize heifer at a county fair. He didn't look sorry. He looked hungry. The officiant, who was clearly on my father's payroll, cleared his throat and asked us to join hands. I looked at the exits. Security guards were blocking the main doors, arms crossed, wearing earpieces. I was trapped in a box with my demons, and my ex-fiancé was standing 3 feet away counting his blood money. But I saw one thing they forgot to guard. The massive 5-tier wedding cake was sitting on a display table next to the altar, right next to the exposed industrial power strip for Jim's professional lighting rig. I solved the ceremony problem by creating a hazard they couldn't ignore. I didn't say a word. I just lunged to the right, shoved the heavy cake with all my strength, and watched it crash directly onto the power strip and the nest of cables. It was spectacular. Sparks flew like fireworks. There was a loud pop, and the smell of ozone filled the air. The main lights blew out instantly, plunging the barn into semi-darkness, illuminated only by the dim red glow of the exit signs. The live stream died. The microphone cut out. The ceremony was dead in the water. I used the confusion to scramble away from the altar, aiming for the side door near the kitchen. I thought I had bought myself a head start, but then came the first new nightmare. I felt a hand grab my wrist in the dark. It wasn't security. It was Mateo. His grip was bruising, much stronger than I remembered. He pulled me close, smelling like expensive cologne and whiskey, and whispered something that froze my blood. He said, "You can break the lights, Susie, but you can't break the contract. You signed the marriage license electronically 3 days ago when you clicked accept on that terms of service update for your trust fund app. We are already legally married." I ripped my arm away, adrenaline masking the pain, and sprinted for the side exit. I burst out into the cool night air, gasping for breath, looking for my car. But that was the second nightmare. My car was gone. In its place was a sleek black van with tinted windows, and the side door was sliding open. 2 men in suits stepped out. They weren't venue security. They were private contractors, and the one in the front was holding a syringe. I didn't wait for the needle to hit my skin. I kicked the suit in the kneecap with every ounce of adrenaline I had, hearing a satisfying crunch as he buckled to the pavement. I didn't wait to see if he stayed down. I hiked up my heavy, ruined dress and sprinted barefoot across the sharp gravel toward the only thing I recognized in this parking lot: Dustin's work truck. I solved the getaway problem because I spent 3 years doing the bookkeeping for his company. I knew he kept a spare key in a magnetic box inside the rear wheel well for his crew. I scrambled under the dirty fender, my fingers scraping against mud and grease until I felt the cold metal of the box. I ripped it open, grabbed the key, and threw myself into the driver's seat, just as the second man slammed his fist against the window. I locked the doors, jammed the key in the ignition, and floored it. The heavy truck roared to life, and I didn't look back as I sideswiped my father's Bentley, tearing the bumper off as I peeled out of the lot. I was doing 80 on the back roads, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the wheel. I thought I was free. I thought I just needed to get to the state line and figure out how to annul a marriage I never agreed to. But then came the first new nightmare. Dustin's phone, which he must have left in the center console during the chaos, lit up. It was already on an active call. I put it on speaker, and I heard Jim's voice. He wasn't yelling. He was calm. He said, "Dustin, initiate the kill switch. She is in the truck." I screamed as the engine cut out instantly. The power steering locked up, and the truck coasted to a dead stop in the middle of a dark 2-lane bridge. I turned the key frantically, but nothing happened. My father had paid for the fleet vehicles, which meant he had rigged them with GPS disable switches for theft prevention. He just turned my getaway car into a brick. Then came the second nightmare. I looked in the rearview mirror. The black van wasn't chasing me anymore. It had stopped at the end of the bridge, blocking the exit, and in front of me, headlights blinded me as a second car pulled up to block the other side. It was a police cruiser. I was trapped on a bridge with no power, no weapon, and nowhere to run. I scrambled into the passenger seat and locked that door too, huddled on the floorboard of the dead truck. I needed a weapon. I ripped open the glove box. No gun, no knife, just a stack of unpaid invoices and a heavy metal flashlight. It wasn't much, but it was better than my fingernails. I saw the cop walking toward the truck from the front, hand on his holster. I saw the private security guys walking from the back. I solved the immediate threat of capture by realizing I couldn't fight them, but I could make them hesitate. I grabbed Dustin's phone again. It was still connected to the truck's Bluetooth even though the engine was dead. I dialed the only number that mattered. I called 911, but I didn't speak to the operator. I put the phone on the dashboard, facing out the windshield, and hit the video call button to live stream straight to my Instagram. I had 40,000 followers from my lifestyle blog. It wasn't millions, but it was enough witnesses. I screamed at the phone, "Officers are boxing me in on the Mill Creek Bridge. My father has disabled my vehicle remotely. If the stream cuts, send help." The officer saw the phone screen lighting up the cab. He saw me recording. He froze. He put his hands up, realizing he was being broadcast to thousands of people live. He couldn't drag me out without it going viral instantly. He backed off, waving the security guys back. I had bought myself a standoff. But then came the first new nightmare. My notification banner dropped down on the screen. It was an email from my bank. Alert. Joint account frozen. My father hadn't just bought my husband. He had used his power of attorney, which I thought I revoked when I was 21, to freeze every cent I had. I had $0 to my name. I couldn't buy gas, I couldn't buy a hotel room, I couldn't hire a lawyer. Then came the second nightmare. The officer didn't smash the window, but he did something worse. He pulled out a megaphone. "Susie, we have a warrant signed by a judge for your detention. It's not a 5150 anymore. You are wanted for grand theft auto and vehicular assault for hitting the Bentley. Step out of the vehicle." I looked at the dashboard. My follower count was dropping. The comments weren't supportive. They were saying things like, "Wait, did she steal the truck?" And "Her dad is posting proof she stole it." Jim wasn't just trapping me physically. He was winning the narrative war in real time. I stared at the comments rolling in, tears finally blurring my vision. They were calling me a thief, a runaway mental patient. Jim had spin doctors working faster than I could type. I was losing the public, and I was losing my mind. I needed to act before the cop decided the bad PR was worth smashing the glass. I solved the narrative problem by escalating the stakes beyond a stolen truck. I grabbed the heavy flashlight and smashed the rear window of the truck cab. Glass shattered everywhere, cutting my bare arms, but I didn't care. I crawled through the opening into the truck bed. The cop shouted, telling me to get down, but I stood up in the cold wind, holding the phone high so the camera could see everything. The police cruiser, the blocked bridge, the private security goons. I didn't yell. I spoke quietly and clearly into the mic. "I am not stealing this truck. I am fleeing a forced marriage to a rapist." I turned the camera to my face. Ask Jim why he paid Mateo $500,000 in 2022. Ask him to release the NDA. If I am crazy, why did he pay $500,000 for my silence? The comments stopped calling me a thief. The chat exploded with questions. Wait, who is Mateo? NDAs don't cover crimes. Is this real? I saw the cop lower the megaphone. He looked confused. This wasn't a standard car chase anymore. But then came the first new nightmare. A helicopter roar drowned out my voice. A spotlight hit me from above, blinding me. It wasn't a news chopper, it was black, unmarked. My father had called in air support, probably claiming I was a high-risk fugitive. The wind from the rotors nearly knocked me off the truck bed. Then came the second nightmare. The truck bed vibrated under my feet. The bridge gate was opening. I was on a drawbridge. The massive steel plates began to separate, lifting toward the sky. The cop car started backing up. The security van backed up. I was stuck on a section of the bridge that was rising into the air at a 45-degree angle. I had to grab the roll bar to keep from sliding off the back into the dark water below. I was suspended 100 feet in the air, live on the internet, clinging to a truck that was slowly tilting toward vertical. I wrapped my arms around the cold steel roll bar, my legs dangling as the truck shifted with a terrifying groan. Gravity was pulling everything loose in the truck bed. Tools, empty gas cans, spare parts, down into the black water below. I heard the splash seconds later. That was how high up I was. I was shaking so violently I almost dropped the phone, but I shoved it into my bra, the camera lens peeking out. I needed the world to see this. I needed a lawyer to see this. I solved the immediate danger of falling by spotting a maintenance ladder welded to the side of the bridge structure, just a few feet from the truck's bumper. If I could swing from the roll bar to the ladder, I could climb down the service access instead of sliding into the river. I took a breath, timed the swing with the wind, and let go. My fingers caught the rusty rung, screaming in protest as my body slammed against the metal grating. I hung there for a second, gasping, before scrambling onto the small maintenance platform. I was safe from falling, but I was still stuck on a rising bridge. Then came the first new nightmare. My phone buzzed against my chest. A text from an unknown number. It was a photo of my little sister Chloe sitting in her dorm room at boarding school. The text read, "Come down, Susie, or we bring her home for a family visit." My blood ran cold. Chloe was 16. She was the only innocent person left in this family. They were threatening to drag her into this hell if I didn't surrender. I couldn't leave her to them. Then came the second nightmare. I looked up at the top of the bridge tower. The operator booth wasn't empty. A man was standing in the window, looking down at me through binoculars. He picked up a radio. Suddenly, the bridge stopped rising. It shuddered and began to lower, but it wasn't lowering back to the road. The gears were grinding, and the platform I was standing on began to rotate outward. The operator was manually overriding the controls to dump me into the river. The platform tilted, and I realized this wasn't an arrest attempt anymore. This was an execution. I scrambled up the tilting platform, my bare feet slipping on the wet metal. I wasn't going into the water, not tonight. I saw a bundle of hydraulic cables running along the side of the bridge arm, leading up toward the operator's booth. I solved the execution problem by becoming the monkey in the wrench. I jumped for the cables, wrapping my legs around the thick, greasy rubber, and started climbing hand over hand toward the booth. The operator saw me coming. He panicked. The bridge arm jerked violently as he tried to shake me off, but I held on until my muscles burned. I reached the catwalk outside the booth, kicked the glass door in with a scream of pure rage, and scrambled inside. The operator, a terrified guy in a high-vis vest who was clearly just following orders, backed into the corner, dropping his radio. I didn't hurt him. I grabbed the master override lever and slammed it into the lock position. The bridge froze. I was safe. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, looking at the blinking control panel. I had the high ground. But then came the first new nightmare. The radio on the floor crackled to life. It was Jim's voice. "Nice climbing, Susie, but check the news." I looked at the small TV mounted in the corner of the booth. Breaking news. A photo of me, mugshot style, was on the screen. The headline read, "Bride wanted for kidnapping sibling." My heart stopped. The text wasn't a threat to hurt Chloe. It was a setup. They had reported Chloe missing from her school and claimed I had snatched her before the wedding. They were framing me for kidnapping my own sister to justify a nationwide manhunt. Then came the second nightmare. I heard heavy boots clanging on the metal stairs leading up to the booth. Not police boots. Tactical boots. I looked out the shattered window. A SWAT team was assembling at the base of the tower. They weren't here to negotiate. They were setting up breach charges on the access door below. I was trapped in a glass box, framed for a felony, with a heavily armed entry team 30 seconds away from blowing the door off its hinges. I looked at the SWAT team below, their laser sights dancing on the steel beams. I had seconds. I couldn't fight them, and I couldn't surrender without losing Chloe forever. I solved the siege problem by changing the battlefield. I looked at the terrified operator. "Give me your vest and your headset," I barked. He handed them over without hesitation. I put on the high-vis vest and the headset, grabbed his clipboard, and kicked the door open. Not the one leading to the stairs, but the service hatch that led to the bridge's internal counterweight system. I slid down the greasy ladder into the dark, cavernous belly of the bridge machinery. It smelled like oil and stagnant water. I could hear the breach charges blow the door above me, shaking the dust from the ceiling. They were clearing the booth, but I was already gone, navigating the maze of massive gears and pistons. I found the maintenance exit at the river level, hidden behind a concrete pylon. I slipped out, invisible in the darkness, and dropped into the freezing water. I let the current drag me downstream, away from the spotlights, until I washed up near a commercial dock a mile away. Shivering and exhausted, I pulled myself onto the muddy bank. But then came the first new nightmare. I needed to find Chloe before the police did. I logged into my secret email, the one I used for the blog, on the operator's stolen phone, which I had shoved in a waterproof bag. There was a message from Chloe, sent 10 minutes ago. Susie, Mom sent a car for me. They're taking me to the lake house. They said you're sick again. Please help. They had her. The lake house was a fortress. High walls, private security, miles from civilization. It was where they sent me when I was sick before. Then came the second nightmare. I heard a low growl behind me. I turned around. Standing at the edge of the dock, blocking my path to the road, was a massive Rottweiler. And holding its leash was not a security guard, but Mateo. He was smiling, wearing a raincoat over his tuxedo. He hadn't stayed at the wedding. He had tracked my phone's last ping before I tossed it. Found you, wifey, he said, unclipping the leash. The dog bared its teeth, ready to tear me apart. I didn't run. You can't outrun a dog like that. I solved the attack problem by using the environment. I backed up toward the edge of the dock near a stack of heavy crab traps. As the dog lunged, I didn't dodge. I grabbed the top trap, a 50-pound cage of steel wire, and swung it with everything I had. The trap collided with the dog in midair, knocking it sideways into the water with a splash. It wasn't hurt, just confused and swimming, but it bought me the split second I needed. Mateo wasn't smiling anymore. He charged at me, reaching for his waistband. I didn't wait to see what he was pulling out. I jumped off the dock, not into the water, but onto the deck of a small fishing boat moored below. I scrambled into the cabin, locking the flimsy door just as Mateo landed on the deck. He slammed against the glass, his face twisted in rage. I saw a flare gun mounted on the wall. I grabbed it. I didn't aim at him. I aimed at the fuel drums stacked on the dock behind him. Back off! Or I blow us both to hell, I screamed. Mateo froze. He looked at the fuel, then back at me. He knew I was crazy enough to do it. He stepped back onto the dock, raising his hands. But then came the first new nightmare. As I fumbled to hot wire the boat's ignition, I saw a news alert flash on the stolen phone. Breaking. Amber alert issued for Chloe Birchwood. Suspect, Susie Birchwood. Vehicle, blue fishing trawler. They were tracking me in real time. My father must have had access to the marina's security cameras. He wasn't just guessing. He was directing the police to my exact location, labeling me a kidnapper in a specific vehicle before I even started the engine. Then came the second nightmare. The boat's radio crackled. It wasn't the police. It was a private frequency. Target acquired. Drone strike authorized if she leaves the harbor. I looked up. A heavy-duty surveillance drone, the kind used for industrial inspection, was hovering silently above the boat. It had a payload attached to its belly. My father wasn't just trying to catch me. He was willing to sink the boat to stop me from reaching Chloe. I stared up at the drone, the red light blinking like a sniper's eye. I couldn't outrun a drone in a slow fishing trawler. I solved the surveillance problem by going dark. I grabbed a heavy tarp from the deck and threw it over the boat's canopy, covering myself and the helm. Then, I didn't start the engine. Instead, I cut the mooring line and used the boat hook to silently push off the dock, drifting into the shadow of a massive cargo ship anchored nearby. The drone hovered, scanning the empty slip, confused by the sudden disappearance of its target. I drifted under the cargo ship's stern, invisible to the sky. Once I was hidden, I hot-wired the trawler, keeping the revs low, and slipped out of the harbor into the open bay, hugging the coastline. I had escaped the immediate net, but I was miles away from the lake house and driving a marked vehicle. Then came the first new nightmare. The fuel gauge on the trawler was broken. I thought I had a full tank, but 5 miles out, the engine sputtered and died. I was drifting in open water, dead in the water, with the current pulling me further out to sea. Then came the second nightmare. I wasn't alone on the boat. I heard a noise from the small cargo hold below deck, a thumping sound. I grabbed the flare gun and kicked the hatch open. Huddled in the corner, wrapped in a blanket, was a teenage boy. He looked up, terrified. It was the deckhand, probably sleeping off a shift when I stole the boat. "Please don't shoot," he stammered, holding up his hands. I lowered the flare gun, my heart pounding. I had just inadvertently kidnapped an innocent kid. Now the Amber Alert wasn't a lie. I had actually abducted a minor. "Get up," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you know how to fix a diesel engine?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, my dad owns this boat." Great, I said, tossing him a wrench. Fix it. Or we both drift until the Coast Guard finds us. And trust me, you don't want to meet the people chasing me. He got to work, but as he opened the engine casing, his face went pale. It's not out of gas, he whispered. The fuel line was cut. Someone sabotaged it before you even got on. Mateo. He hadn't just been trying to stop me on the dock. He had disabled the boat beforehand as a trap. He wanted me stranded out here. And looking at the horizon, I saw why. A sleek, fast speedboat was cutting through the waves, heading straight for us. I watched the speedboat cut through the waves, a white V of foam narrowing the distance between us. It wasn't the police. It was matte black, no markings. My father's private security detail. They weren't coming to arrest me. They were coming to scrub the problem. I looked at the kid whose name was Sam. I solved the sitting duck problem by weaponizing the dead boat. Sam, I said, pointing to the emergency life raft canister strapped to the roof. Deploy that. Throw it in the water on the starboard side. Why? He asked, hands shaking. Just do it, I yelled. While he struggled with the latches, I grabbed the remaining fuel canister, the one used for the backup generator, and poured it all over the aft deck. The fumes were dizzying. I ripped a piece of fabric from my ruined wedding dress, stuffed it into the empty gas can, and made a Molotov cocktail. The speedboat was 500 yards out. I could see 2 men on the bow holding rifles. Sam tossed the raft into the water. Jump! I screamed. We both dove overboard, hitting the freezing water just as the speedboat slowed to board the trawler. We swam hard for the raft, hiding behind the bulk of the fishing boat. The security team pulled alongside. I heard boots hit the deck. Clear the cabin, a voice shouted. That was my cue. I treaded water, lit the rag with a waterproof lighter I found in the emergency kit, and hurled the Molotov over the gunnel. It landed right in the puddle of diesel. The explosion was deafening. A fireball engulfed the back of the trawler, sending a shockwave that pushed us underwater. When I surfaced, the trawler was an inferno. The security boat was peeling away, smoke billowing from its side where the fire had jumped. They were retreating. We scrambled into the life raft, shivering and gasping. We were alive. But then came the first new nightmare. The explosion had attracted attention. A Coast Guard cutter appeared on the horizon, lights flashing. They were coming for the distress signal. I couldn't be found. If the feds took me, they'd hand me back to my father's lawyers before I could say habeas corpus. Then came the second nightmare. Sam looked at me, his teeth chattering. Susie, he said, pointing at the water. The raft? It's leaking. I looked down. A piece of shrapnel from the explosion had sliced the rubber. The floor was filling with water. We were sinking in the middle of the bay, with the Coast Guard closing in on one side and a burning boat on the other. We have to swim, I yelled over the roar of the fire. I pointed toward the dark outline of the breakwall, about 200 yards away. The smoke from the burning trawler was drifting right over it, creating a thick, gray curtain. I solved the exposure problem by using the disaster as cover. We slid into the freezing black water, kicking away from the sinking raft just as the Coast Guard spotlight swept over the spot where we had been sitting seconds before. The swim was brutal. My limbs felt like lead and the cold was stealing the air from my lungs. But we made it. We hauled ourselves up onto the jagged rocks of the breakwall, shivering so hard my teeth rattled. We scrambled over the seawall and ran toward the nearest structure, a massive modern beach house that looked closed up for the season. I used a rock to shatter the side window, unlatched it, and we tumbled inside onto a plush rug. We were out of the water, out of sight, and alive. But then came the first new nightmare. As I stood up to find a towel, I saw a blue light pulsing on the wall by the front door. It was a smart home security panel. And right in the center of the screen was a logo I knew better than my own face. Birchwood Home Defense. My father's company. This wasn't just a random house. It was part of his high-end client network. The moment I broke that window, a silent alarm didn't just go to the police, it went directly to Jim's private dispatch team. He knew exactly where I was to the square foot. Then came the second nightmare. Sam wasn't looking for a towel. He was digging into his wet jeans. He pulled out a small, waterproof flash drive. He looked at me, his eyes wide and terrified. Susie, he stammered. I wasn't sleeping on the boat by accident. I was hiding. I stole this from Mateo's office at the marina this morning. I stared at the drive. This kid wasn't a random bystander. He was a target, and he had just handed me the reason why Mateo was willing to blow up a boat to kill us both. I heard tires screeching on the pavement outside. They were here, and this time it wasn't the police. It was the cleanup crew. I snatched the flash drive from Sam's shaking hand. What is on this? I hissed, peeking through the blinds. 2 black SUVs had just pulled onto the lawn, headlights cutting through the living room darkness. Men were spilling out, racking the slides on suppressed rifles. Sam swallowed hard. Proof, he whispered. Mateo isn't just a marina manager. He's moving illegal cargo through the docks for your father. Drugs? Weapons? I don't know, but the manifest is on there. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't just about controlling me or a wedding anymore. This was a federal crime ring. That's why Jim was so desperate. If I talked, his empire wouldn't just crumble, he would go to prison for life. I solved the ambush problem by going on the offensive. I knew how Birchwood security systems worked. I grew up in a house wired with this tech. I ran to the smart panel on the wall. The system was in silent alarm mode, which meant the internal sirens were disabled to catch intruders unaware. I punched in the master override code, my birthday. My father used it for everything because he was too arrogant to think anyone else would guess it. The panel beeped green. Access granted. I tapped the panic icon, but not the one that called the police. I hit system test full audio. Instantly, the house exploded with sound. Every siren, every speaker, every alarm blared at 120 decibels. The lights in the house began strobing violently. Outside, the men flinched, covering their ears, disoriented by the sensory assault. "Run!" I screamed at Sam. We sprinted out the back door while the security team was blinded and deafened. We vaulted the back fence into the neighbor's yard and kept running until my lungs burned. We found a beat-up sedan parked in a driveway with the engine running, a pizza delivery guy dropping off an order. I didn't hesitate. I shoved Sam into the passenger seat, jumped in, and floored it before the poor guy even reached the porch. But then came the first new nightmare. As we hit the highway, a notification popped up on the car's dashboard screen. It wasn't a GPS alert. It was a localized emergency broadcast. Fugitive alert. Armed and dangerous. Shoot on-site authorization granted for private contractors in Sector 4. My father had declared martial law on me. He had used his political connections to get a shoot-on-site order authorized for his own mercenaries under the guise of anti-terrorism. Then came the second nightmare. Sam plugged the flash drive into the car's USB port to check the files. His face went white. "Susie," he said, his voice trembling. "The manifest? It's not drugs. It's names. It's a list of trafficking victims. And the last name on the list is Chloe. They weren't taking Chloe to the lake house for safety, they were shipping her out tonight." I stared at Chloe's name on the glowing screen, the letters burning into my retinas. The destination code next to her name was Port 4A, midnight departure. It was 10:45 p.m. I had 75 minutes to stop a shipping container from leaving the country with my little sister inside. I solved the transportation problem by driving like I had a death wish. I kept the pizza delivery sign on the roof. It was practically urban camouflage. Cops look for speeding sports cars, not a beat-up Honda Civic smelling like pepperoni. I wove through traffic, hitting 90 on the shoulder, heading straight back into the belly of the beast, the industrial port. Sam was typing furiously on the laptop, trying to decrypt the gate codes from the flash drive. "Got it," he yelled. "Gate C is automated. I can spoof the entry signal." We roared up to the massive chain link fence. The scanner beeped, and the gate rolled open just enough for me to scrape the car through. We were in. The port was a maze of stacked containers, towering cranes, and blinding floodlights. I killed the headlights. "We have to find Terminal 4A, I whispered. But then came the first new nightmare. Terminal 4A wasn't a quiet loading dock. It was a fortress. 4 armed guards were patrolling the perimeter of a massive cargo ship, and right in the center of the loading zone sat a single black container. I saw Jim standing next to it, shaking hands with a man in a captain's uniform. My father was personally overseeing the sale of his own daughter. Then came the second nightmare. I needed a distraction to get close. I told Sam to stay in the car and keep the engine running. I crept forward, hiding behind a forklift. I needed to get to the crane controls. I climbed the ladder of the nearest gantry crane, 50 feet in the air. I reached the cab and looked down. I had a clear shot to drop a container to block the ship's ramp. I reached for the joystick, but the cab door locked behind me with a heavy thud. I spun around. The control panel screen flashed red. User unauthorized, lockdown initiated, ventilation purge active. A hiss filled the small glass box. Gas. They had trapped me in the crane cab, and they were pumping in knockout gas. I watched helplessly through the glass floor as the crane began to move on its own, swinging me directly over the black container where my father stood. Looking up with a smile, he waved. I held my breath, jamming my sleeve against my nose, but the sweet, chemical smell was already clouding my vision. I was dangling 60 feet above the dock in a glass coffin. I solved the gas problem by refusing to breathe and finding the one thing they didn't account for: blunt force trauma. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from the wall bracket and swung it with every ounce of hysterical strength I had against the floor-to-ceiling glass panel. The first hit cracked it, the second hit shattered it. The glass exploded outward, raining down like diamonds onto the dock below. The fresh sea air rushed in, clearing the gas. I gasped, filling my lungs, but I didn't stop. I looked down. The crane was still lowering me toward the ship's deck. delivering me like a package. I wasn't going to let them take me. I climbed out onto the metal frame of the cab, wind whipping my hair. I looked at the black container below. I saw the locking mechanism on the top corners. If I could land on it, I could unlock it from the outside. I jumped. It was a 20-foot drop. I hit the top of the metal container hard, rolling to absorb the impact. Pain shot through my ankle, but I was up in a second. The guards were shouting, raising their rifles, but they couldn't shoot without hitting the cargo. I scrambled to the locking levers, but then came the first new nightmare. The levers were welded shut. Fresh weld marks. Still hot to the touch. My father had sealed the container permanently. There was no way to open it without a blowtorch. I could hear muffled banging from inside. Susie! It was Chloe's voice. She was in there. Then came the second nightmare. The crane above me didn't stop moving. The massive magnetic clamp descended, locking onto the corners of the container I was standing on. I felt the lurch as the crane lifted the container, and me, into the air. We were swinging out over the dark water toward the open hold of the cargo ship. I was trapped on top of the box, riding it down into the belly of the vessel. And standing on the deck, waiting for me, was Mateo. He was holding a remote control for the crane in one hand and a gun in the other. "Welcome aboard, honey," he yelled over the wind. I crouched on top of the swinging container, the wind tearing at my clothes. Mateo was 10 feet below, aiming the pistol at my chest. The container hovered over the open cargo hold, a black pit that dropped 3 stories down into the ship. If he dropped the box now, the impact would kill Chloe inside. If I jumped, he'd shoot me out of the air. I solved the standoff by targeting his ego. "Mateo," I screamed over the roar of the engines. "You think Jim is going to pay you? You're a liability. The moment this ship leaves port, you're dead weight." He hesitated. The gun wavered for a fraction of a second. He looked toward the bridge where my father was watching. That doubt was all I needed. I didn't jump at him. I jumped at the crane's magnetic clamp cable. I grabbed the thick steel wire, swinging my body like a pendulum, and kicked Mateo square in the chest with both feet. He flew backward, hitting the railing with a sickening crunch, and the remote skittered across the deck. I dropped to the deck, pain exploding in my bad ankle, and scrambled for the remote. I grabbed it just as a bullet sparked off the metal plating next to my hand. Jim was shooting at me. My own father was standing on the bridge wing, firing a handgun. But then came the first new nightmare. I hit the release button on the remote to drop the container onto the deck, safe from the hold. Nothing happened. The light on the remote was dead. The batteries had flown out when Mateo dropped it. Chloe was still dangling over the pit, and the crane was slowly lowering her into the darkness. Then came the second nightmare. A siren wailed, a deep, mournful sound that vibrated through the hull. The ship's engines roared to life. The gangway was retracting. The ship was leaving. We were moving away from the dock. I looked back at the shore. Sam and the car were getting smaller. I was trapped on a moving cargo ship with a murderous father, a sealed container holding my sister, and no way off. I dove behind a massive winch as a bullet ricocheted off the steel deck inches from my ear. I couldn't reach the crane controls, and the remote was dead. I solved the gravity problem by resorting to sabotage. I saw the exposed hydraulic lines running up the crane's leg. I grabbed a heavy iron pry bar from the emergency station and swung it like a baseball bat. The line burst. High-pressure fluid sprayed everywhere, and the magnetic clamp lost power instantly. The container plummeted 10 feet, slamming onto the steel hatch cover with a thunderous crash that shook the entire ship. The weld marks on the door popped from the impact. I heard Chloe scream my name. She was alive. Jim screamed in rage and aimed the gun at me again, but the ship suddenly lurched violently. The anchor I had kicked the release lever for seconds earlier finally caught the harbor floor. The massive chain screamed as it tore through the hawse pipe, jerking the ship sideways and throwing my father off his feet. The gun slid across the deck and into the ocean. I scrambled to the container, prying the warped doors open. Chloe tumbled out, sobbing, and I wrapped my arms around her. We were safe. The Coast Guard cutter was pulling alongside, boarding ramps slamming onto the rail. Officers swarmed the deck, tackling my father before he could stand up. It was over. I had won. But then came the first new nightmare. As they dragged Jim away in handcuffs, he didn't look defeated. He looked at me with a chilling, triumphant smile. He leaned in as he passed us. "You didn't stop the shipment, Susie. Chloe was the decoy. The real container left on the morning tide." Then came the second nightmare. An FBI agent walked up to me. He didn't offer me a blanket. He held up a warrant. "Suzanne Birchwood, you are under arrest for corporate espionage and the murder of Matteo Rossi." His body just washed up under the pier. I looked at Chloe, who was clinging to me, and realized the war wasn't over. It had just begun.